So we know now that if we want to grow our muscles, all we have to do is get to failure. Doesn't matter if we lift a heavy weight, a light weight. If you want to make your muscle bigger, just get to the point where you can't lift the weight. You can't push, you can't curl, you can't do the positive phase. And if you really want to get it to grow, get it so that you do a couple of extra repetitions. If you want to get stronger, all you have to do is lift a heavy weight. You don't have to go to failure. You just lift a heavy weight. Your muscles aren't going to get as big, but you're going to get strong. And you're going to get equally strong as if you do as much volume as you want. It's all about lifting that heavy weight. So now we know that. We're going to go in, we're going to lift a heavy weight, and we're going to go to failure. Okay, so now what happens in our body? What happens in the muscle that I just exercised that's going to cause it to get bigger? Well, this is what happens. So this is by Stu Phillips himself during his postdoc in Texas. And what he was doing here is he's looking at, again, muscle protein synthesis in A, and then muscle protein breakdown. So again, this is like our bank account. Our protein synthesis is our income. The protein breakdown is our spending. So if we spend more, if we spend more than we make, we're going to go into negative balance. Okay, we're going to lose a lot of money from our bank account, or our bank account's going to shrink. If we have a greater income than we have expenditures, now our bank account gets bigger. So now we're going to grow our muscle bigger. Okay, so let's look at what happens from rest. Here, you do resistance exercise, and then 3 hours later you look, more than doubled protein synthesis rates. And that stays high for 24, all the way up to 48 hours later. So you're going to keep synthesizing more protein for 2 days just by doing a single bout of exercise. What happens to breakdown? Breakdown also goes up. It goes up a little bit less. So this is going up about, it's more than doubling. So it's going up about 120%. This is going up from about 0.1 to about 0.15, so it's going about 50%. So this is going up about 120%, this is going up 50%. Oh, look, that's balance, means that our income is higher than our expenditures. We're going to get bigger, okay? That protein breakdown rate actually stays high out to 24 hours, but then by 48 hours it's back down, even though protein synthesis is still significantly elevated above the baseline. So what this is telling us is that when we lift a heavy weight, what we're doing is we're increasing protein synthesis. And we're doing it to a greater degree than we do for protein breakdown. So we're increasing synthesis more than breakdown. The result is now we're accumulating more muscle. And when we go to failure, we increase protein synthesis. So what controls it? And this is my PhD in a single slide. So, this is 5 years of work. I want you to take at least an hour on this slide. Realistically, 2 minutes like everything else. This is the activity of this protein complex called mTOR complex 1. And what we did is we measured the activity of mTOR complex 1 between 30 minutes and 6 hours after a single bout of exercise. So after that bout of exercise, which is 30 minutes to 6 hours after exercise, we measured the activity of this protein complex mTOR complex 1. And then what we did is we trained the animals for 6 weeks. And then we looked to see how much the muscle grew in size. And so what we found is that there was a direct correlation between how much mTOR activity increased in these muscles and how big those muscles got from training. So in a muscle that wasn't going to get big from training, it didn't increase mTOR activity. In two muscles that increased mTOR activity a lot, we saw that they had a really big increase in muscle size. And so what this says is that suggests that maybe mTOR is driving the increase in muscle protein synthesis and muscle mass that comes from resistance exercise. So this is called mTOR. It's the mechanistic target of rapamycin. And rapamycin is a drug that comes from the island of Easter Island, which is also known to the people who are the indigenous population there as Rapa Nui. So Rapa Nui gave us rapamycin, and rapamycin is a drug that binds to mTOR and it prevents it from working. So what Blake Rasmussen's group did out of Texas is they went in and they gave people rapamycin, or they gave them a control drug, a placebo control. They then had them do resistance exercise. So they took a muscle biopsy before exercise and then after exercise, 5 hours after exercise. And they looked to see what happened to muscle protein synthesis after resistance exercise. And just like I showed you before, we increase protein synthesis when we do resistance exercise. That's going to make our muscles bigger. But look what happens in the group that had rapamycin. The rapamycin that blocks mTOR activation, no increase in protein synthesis after resistance exercise. So what this is saying is that relationship between mTOR and muscle size is maybe it's a causal relationship, because there's a correlation between the two. And then when we block mTOR activity using rapamycin, the muscle protein synthesis doesn't go up. But how about muscle size? Well, one of my former colleagues here at UC Davis, Sue Bondine, did a study where she did an overload of muscle in a mouse, and every day she would give them rapamycin. And so you can see that within 7 days, there's a nice increase in weight in the control group, but in the rapamycin group, you see that that's significantly lower. And then 14 days later, you have this, again, a really big increase in muscle weight that is completely blocked in the presence of rapamycin. And so what this tells us is that when we do resistance exercise, we activate this protein complex, mTOR complex 1. And the more mTOR complex 1 activity we get, the bigger our muscles are going to get from training. And so if we do a really heavy weight and we get a big heavy weight, we go to failure, we're going to activate all of those fibers within the muscle. We're going to activate mTOR within all of those fibers, and that's going to grow all of those fibers. And that's really the key. So that when we do resistance exercise, we get a big load across the muscle fiber. The more muscle fibers we get, the reason why going to failure is important is because failure is the only time a human, because we're lazy, it's the only time a human is going to use all of the muscle fibers within their muscle. So when I can do a concentric contraction, I don't need to use all of my muscle fibers because I don't use all of my motor units. But if I keep doing that until I get to failure, now every single motor unit gets recruited because I need every single one of them to lift the weight now. So the only time I get across all of the fibers get load across them is at failure. That's the difference between that human study I showed you and the rat study I showed you. Because the rats, we were stimulating them with electricity. So we would stimulate all of the muscle fibers. So that time told us that only load mattered. But in people, it's load, but it's also load to failure, because only failure will we get what we get with electrical stimulation in the rat, which is contraction of all of the muscle fibers within the muscle. Okay, so if you get load across all of the muscle fibers in the fiber, you're going to get mTOR activation across those fibers. You're going to get hypertrophy across those fibers. So the only time we get mTOR across all the fibers within our muscle is when we get that muscle to failure. So the truth about building muscle is that in order to increase muscle mass, the load is going to be important, but the important aspect is getting to failure. So if you want to increase muscle mass, the load is important. It's going to drive this, but you have to get all the load into all of the muscle fibers, and that only happens at failure. Anywhere from 1 to 5 sets of 6 to 8 repetitions or 10 to 12 repetitions will increase size and strength in most people. So you don't need to do more than 1 set. If you can get to failure in 1 set, you only have to do 1 set. If you can't get to failure in 1 set because it's a complex move or all of these things, then you have to do further sets. But the only reason to do extra sets is if you can't get to failure in 1 set. After resistance exercise, we increase both synthesis and degradation. Only when protein synthesis goes up more than degradation do we increase our muscle mass. And that only happens when we're fed. And I'll show you that that's where nutrition comes into this. And the reason that we increase muscle protein synthesis and we increase muscle mass after resistance exercise is down to this protein mTOR complex 1, which is a kinase that regulates protein synthesis and degradation.